I discovered my therapist was sharing my sessions as entertainment at dinner parties, so I gave her something really worth talking about. Dr. Rebecca Winters came highly recommended, Yale-educated, published author, waiting list longer than my grocery receipt. For 6 months, I poured my heart out about childhood trauma, failed relationships, and panic attacks that left me hyperventilating in grocery store aisles while strangers stared. She seemed perfect. Expensive leather chairs, diplomas covering every wall, and this way of nodding that made you feel heard. I trusted her completely with my darkest secrets. The first red flag came at my friend Sarah's birthday party. A woman in an expensive silk dress approached me, eyes bright with recognition. "You're Emma, right? The one with the mother issues?" My blood turned cold. The punch cup slipped from my fingers. I'd never met this woman in my life. "Rebecca tells the most fascinating stories about her clients," she continued, oblivious to my horror. "Obviously, she changes names, but your case is particularly compelling. The grocery store panic attacks, the way you called her sobbing from the parking lot, brilliant material for understanding modern anxiety." Other party guests had turned to look. Some were nodding knowingly. My stomach dropped as I realized they'd all heard my story too. I excused myself and locked myself in the bathroom, hands shaking violently. Changed names. There was only one therapist named Rebecca I knew. The next week, I sat across from Dr. Winters, studying her face differently. The same practice smile, the same designer blazer. But now I saw something else. Calculation behind those kind blue eyes. When I mentioned feeling betrayed by someone I trusted, she leaned forward with that practiced empathy. "Trust is fundamental to healing," she said. "When someone violates that trust, it can reopen old wounds." The irony made me physically nauseous. That weekend, I did something that would have horrified my former self. I followed her. Dr. Winters lived in an upscale neighborhood where houses looked like museum displays. Saturday night, luxury cars filled her driveway. Through the dining room window, I watched her holding court at a dinner party, wine glass in hand, animated gestures painting a story. My story. She was describing my panic attacks, how I'd called her sobbing from a Walmart parking lot because the fluorescent lights triggered flashbacks. The guests hung on every word, some laughing at parts that had broken me. One woman actually wiped tears from laughing so hard. One man raised his glass. To Rebecca, who makes therapy sound better than Netflix. I stood in her bushes, watching strangers toast my trauma while sipping wine that probably cost more than I spent on groceries. Monday morning, I scheduled an emergency session. "I've been having disturbing thoughts," I told her, keeping my voice steady. "About revenge fantasies, detailed ones." Her pen moved across the notepad with renewed interest. I could practically see the dollar signs in her eyes. This would make excellent dinner party material. "Tell me more about these fantasies," she said, leaning forward. I took a shaky breath, channeling every acting class I'd taken in college. I keep imagining what I'd do to someone who betrayed my trust, someone who pretended to care about me but was actually using me. For the next 45 minutes, I spun elaborate tales of revenge involving public humiliation and career destruction. She took notes furiously, occasionally asking for clarification on the more creative details. "This level of planning is concerning," she said as our session ended. "We should explore this anger next week." I scheduled another appointment and left, knowing exactly what she'd be discussing at her next dinner party. The irony was delicious. She was so eager to harvest my fake revenge fantasies that she completely missed the real revenge plot unfolding right in front of her perfectly sculpted face. That night, I started planning for real. First, I needed concrete proof. All I had was secondhand accounts from strangers at a party and my own observations through her window. A licensing board would need more than that. I contacted my friend Marcus, who worked in IT security for a major corporation and had a side business helping people with technology problems that weren't always strictly legal. "I need help with a project," I told him over coffee at a small cafe downtown, choosing my words carefully. "Someone has been sharing private information about me without consent. I need to document it happening." Marcus was a tall, skinny guy with thick glasses who looked more like a librarian than someone who could hack into Pentagon servers before breakfast. He studied my face for a long moment, his dark eyes serious behind the wire-rimmed frames. "What kind of private information?" he asked quietly, leaning forward across the small table. "Medical? Therapy sessions? HIPAA violation stuff?" His expression hardened immediately. Marcus had been in therapy himself after a messy divorce that had left him emotionally devastated, and the idea of someone violating that sacred trust clearly struck a deep nerve. "That's seriously fucked up," he said, pushing his glasses up his nose with barely controlled anger. "What do you need?" Within 2 days, he'd provided me with a collection of tiny recording devices that looked like everyday objects: phone chargers, pens, picture frames, even a fake plant that could sit innocuously on a shelf. The technology was remarkable. Each device could record crystal-clear audio within a 15-foot radius for up to 72 hours and automatically upload to a secure cloud server that couldn't be traced back to me. "These are completely legal as long as you're recording conversations you're a party to," Marcus explained as he showed me how to operate them in his cluttered apartment. "Patient has every right to record their own therapy sessions. It's the therapist who's breaking the law by sharing that information with third parties." He also provided me with a detailed explanation of federal HIPAA laws, state privacy regulations, and professional ethics codes that governed mental health practitioners. The violations Dr. Winters was committing weren't just unethical. They were serious federal crimes that could result in years in prison and hundreds of thousands of dollars in fines. During my next session, I arrived early and asked to use the restroom. While Dr. Winters reviewed her notes in her office, I quickly plugged one of the phone charger devices into the wall outlet behind her leather chair. The tiny indicator light showed it was already recording everything within range. I spent that session describing even more elaborate revenge fantasies, including specific details about how I'd document someone's professional misconduct, gather evidence of their violations, and systematically report them to every relevant licensing board and professional organization. Dr. Winters seemed particularly interested in that part, asking detailed questions about my imaginary evidence-gathering process with an enthusiasm that made my skin crawl. "It's interesting how methodical your fantasy planning has become," she observed, her pen moving rapidly across the expensive paper. "This suggests a highly organized personality responding to feelings of powerlessness with detailed control fantasies. The specificity indicates these thoughts are serving an important psychological function. Sometimes I imagine recording them," I said, watching her reaction carefully, "catching them in the act of doing something wrong, having proof that no one could deny or explain away." She nodded approvingly, completely missing the irony that she was being recorded at that very moment. "Documentation can provide a sense of validation, even in fantasy," she said with professional authority. "It's the mind's way of creating evidence for experiences that might otherwise be dismissed or minimized by others." 3 days later, I returned to retrieve the device, claiming I'd forgotten my phone charger and needed it for work. Dr. Winters was busy with another patient, so her receptionist, a kind older woman named Margaret who had no idea what her boss was doing, let me grab it quickly from the office. That evening, I settled in with a bottle of wine and my laptop, prepared to listen to every minute of the 72-hour recording. What I heard made me physically sick, but also gave me everything I needed to destroy her career completely. Dr. Winters had shared intimate details from our sessions with at least 6 different people during that 3-day period. I heard her on the phone with colleagues, discussing my fascinating case study and the rich material my revenge fantasies provided for understanding modern trauma responses. She'd called her sister in California to share amusing anecdotes about her disturbed patients and their creative delusions. She'd even practiced her dinner party stories out loud, refining the delivery for maximum entertainment value like a comedian preparing new material. "You should have seen her face when I suggested she keep a journal," she laughed during one phone call to someone named Dr. Patricia Chen. "She actually thinks writing down her violent fantasies will be therapeutic. The level of delusion is almost charming in its naivety." But the recording revealed something even worse than I'd imagined. Dr. Winters was violating HIPAA laws with multiple clients, not just me. I heard her discussing a 16-year-old patient's suicide attempt with disturbing casualness, sharing details about an elderly man's dementia symptoms with someone who was clearly not a healthcare provider, and worst of all, laughing about a domestic violence survivor's hilarious attempts to appear strong and independent during sessions. The teen's case particularly horrified me. She described how the boy had tried to hang himself in his family's garage after being bullied at school for his sexuality, giving explicit details about the method he'd used and his parents' reaction when they found him. She shared his real name, his school, and enough identifying information that anyone listening could easily figure out who she was talking about. "The parents are in complete denial about his orientation," she told her sister during a 40-minute phone call. "They keep insisting it's just a phase, which is probably why he tried to kill himself in the first place. The whole family is a psychological goldmine. She wasn't just a bad therapist. She was a predator who fed off human misery and had built her entire social life around monetizing other people's pain and suffering." The recording device had also captured something I hadn't expected, a lengthy phone conversation where Dr. Winters discussed her upcoming presentation at the American Psychological Association's annual conference in Chicago. She was planning to use anonymized patient cases as examples in her presentation on innovative approaches to treating complex trauma in modern patients. My case was her star example. She'd already written most of the presentation, describing my panic attacks, childhood medical trauma, and recent concerning violent ideation in detail that would make me easily identifiable to anyone who knew me. She even planned to include quotes from our sessions, claiming they demonstrated classic trauma response patterns in contemporary therapeutic settings. I had her, but I wasn't done collecting evidence yet. Over the next 2 weeks, I became the perfect patient. I scheduled additional sessions twice a week, claiming my revenge fantasies were escalating and becoming more detailed and disturbing. I described elaborate plans involving identity theft, blackmail, professional sabotage, and systematic destruction of someone's personal and professional life. Dr. Winters ate it up like a starving person at a buffet, taking detailed notes and encouraging me to explore these feelings fully without judgment or censorship. She even suggested I keep a journal to track my progress in processing these violent thoughts, claiming it would help me understand the psychological mechanisms behind my fantasies. "The more detailed you can make these imaginary scenarios, the more we can understand about your underlying psychological needs," she explained during one session, her eyes bright with excitement. "Don't hold back. This is a safe space to explore even your darkest thoughts without fear of judgment." Each session was recorded using different devices Marcus had given me. I rotated between the phone charger, a pen that I'd place on her desk, and a small picture frame that I'd position on the shelf behind her chair. By the end of 2 weeks, I had over 12 hours of Dr. Winters violating professional ethics, discussing confidential patient information with unauthorized people, and encouraging what she believed to be genuine violent fantasies in a vulnerable patient. During our final session, I decided to test just how far she'd go in violating her professional responsibilities. "I've been doing research," I told her, keeping my voice carefully measured and slightly ominous, "about the person who betrayed me. I found out where they work, where they live, their professional affiliations. I even looked up their licensing board and complaint process." Dr. Winters leaned forward like a cat spotting a wounded bird, completely absorbed in what she thought was my descent into dangerous obsession. "How does having this information make you feel?" she asked, her voice barely concealing her excitement at this new development. "Powerful," I said, letting a slight smile play across my lips. Like I could destroy their entire career with a single phone call. Everything they've worked for, gone. All their professional relationships, ruined. Their reputation, shattered beyond repair. She nodded approvingly, her pen dancing across the page with enthusiasm. "That sense of agency can be quite therapeutic, even if you never act on these feelings," she said, completely missing the fact that she was encouraging potentially dangerous behavior. "The fantasy of control often helps trauma survivors process feelings of powerlessness. But what if I did act on it?" I asked, tilting my head in a perfect imitation of her own mannerism. "Hypothetically, of course. What if I actually reported them for professional misconduct? Would that be morally wrong, even if they deserved it?" Dr. Winters actually smiled, a cold, calculating expression that looked nothing like the warm empathy she usually performed for her patients. "Sometimes people need to face consequences for their actions," she said, her voice taking on an almost predatory quality. "If someone is genuinely harming others through professional misconduct, reporting them could actually protect future victims. The greater good sometimes requires individual sacrifice." I nodded thoughtfully, as if processing this profound wisdom from my trusted therapist. "You're absolutely right," I said. "Some people do need to face consequences for their actions. It's almost like a moral obligation to make sure they can't hurt anyone else." She beamed at me like a proud teacher whose student had finally grasped a difficult concept. "Exactly. You're developing a much healthier perspective on justice and accountability. This represents significant progress in your healing journey." That night, I worked until 3 a.m. compiling everything into a comprehensive case file. 12 hours of audio recordings, detailed transcripts of every violation, session notes showing the pattern of abuse, copies of her calendar proving when she'd discussed my case with unauthorized people, and comprehensive research into every patient she'd mentioned by name during her recorded conversations. I created a detailed timeline showing how her violations had escalated over time, included relevant state and federal laws she'd broken, and attached professional ethics codes she'd systematically ignored. The documentation was thorough enough to make a prosecutor weep with joy and detailed enough to ensure no lawyer could find loopholes or technicalities to exploit. I sent it all to the state licensing board with a detailed complaint outlining her HIPAA violations, professional misconduct, and systematic abuse of patient trust. But I didn't stop there. I sent copies to the American Psychological Association, her malpractice insurance company, the conference organizers where she was scheduled to present, and every professional organization she belonged to. But I still wasn't finished with my campaign for justice. I also compiled individual packets for the families of every patient she'd violated. The parents of the 16-year-old suicide attempt victim got recordings of her discussing their child's private struggles, along with contact information for attorneys who specialized in medical privacy violations. The family of the elderly man with dementia received evidence of her sharing his medical information with unauthorized people, plus documentation of how she'd mocked his condition for entertainment. The domestic violence survivor got comprehensive documentation of how her private trauma had been turned into cocktail party entertainment, along with resources for pursuing legal action. Each packet included a detailed explanation of their legal rights, contact information for attorneys who specialized in medical privacy violations, and copies of all relevant evidence organized in a way that would make it easy for lawyers to build cases. Then I called Channel 7 News and asked to speak with their investigative reporting team. "I have documentation of a local therapist systematically violating patient privacy laws," I told the investigative reporter, a woman named Jessica Martinez who specialized in healthcare fraud cases. "Multiple patients, multiple violations, recordings of everything. Are you interested in a story that could expose widespread abuse in the mental health care system?" They were very interested, extremely interested, in fact. 2 days later, my phone rang at 7:30 a.m. Dr. Winters' name appeared on the screen, and when I answered, her voice was tight with barely controlled panic. "Emma," she said, the polished professional veneer completely gone and replaced with raw desperation. "I need to see you immediately. There's been a terrible misunderstanding. People are making accusations that simply aren't true, and I need to explain." "No misunderstanding," I said calmly, sipping my morning coffee and watching the sunrise through my kitchen window. "You violated my trust and the trust of every patient who confided in you. You turned our trauma into entertainment for your dinner parties and professional advancement." "I never used real names in social settings," she said, her voice rising to an almost hysterical pitch. "Everything was completely anonymized and protected by doctor-patient confidentiality. I followed all proper protocols." "You used enough details that complete strangers recognized me at a party," I interrupted, my voice remaining steady and controlled. "And I have recordings of you using real names and identifying information for multiple patients in conversations with unauthorized people who have no legitimate need for that information." The silence stretched for so long, I thought she'd hung up. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely a whisper. "What do you want? Money? I can pay you whatever you need. We can work something out privately without involving the authorities." "I don't want anything from you," I said, feeling a deep sense of satisfaction at her obvious terror. "I already have everything I need to ensure you never hurt another patient again." "Please," she begged, all pretense of professionalism completely abandoned. "I made mistakes, but my career, my reputation, my family, I have children who depend on me. This will destroy everything I've worked for." "Your career was built on exploiting vulnerable people," I said, my voice hardening. "Your reputation was based on violating the most fundamental trust in healthcare. Maybe it's time for both of those things to end, so other patients can be protected from you. I can change, she said desperately. I can get help, take additional training, make amends. Please don't destroy my life over some stupid mistakes. These weren't mistakes, I said. They were deliberate choices you made repeatedly over many years. You chose to violate patient confidentiality for your own entertainment and professional gain. You chose to encourage dangerous fantasies instead of providing proper treatment. You chose to build your career on other people's suffering. I hung up and immediately blocked her number. The story broke 3 days later with the headline, "Local Therapist Under Investigation for Systematic Patient Privacy Violation." The article, written by Jessica Martinez, included quotes from multiple violated patients, details about the ongoing ethics investigation, and mention of potential criminal charges for HIPAA violations. The response was immediate and devastating for Dr. Winters. Her practice closed within a week, with her receptionist leaving apologetic voicemails explaining that all patients would receive copies of their files and referrals to other providers. Her license was suspended pending investigation. The conference presentation was canceled. Her malpractice insurance company dropped her after reviewing the evidence I'd provided. The local medical community was buzzing with gossip about the case. Other therapists began frantically reviewing their own practices, terrified of similar exposure. The licensing board announced new mandatory training on patient privacy laws and implementation of random compliance audits. But the real satisfaction came when the criminal investigation began. The district attorney's office assigned a prosecutor who specialized in healthcare fraud. Detective Maria Santos called me to schedule an interview about the case, and when we met at the police station, her professionalism was tinged with obvious anger at what Dr. Winters had done. "I've been working healthcare crimes for 8 years, she told me as we sat in the stark interview room with its fluorescent lights and metal table. "I've never seen documentation this thorough or violations this systematic. You basically built the entire case for us." "I had good motivation," I said simply. The prosecutor, James Mitchell, was a thin man with graying hair who looked like he survived on coffee and righteous indignation. When he reviewed my evidence, his eyes lit up with the kind of enthusiasm prosecutors reserve for slam-dunk cases. "Dr. Winters violated federal law repeatedly and systematically," he explained, spreading my documentation across the conference table. "HIPAA violations can result in criminal penalties of up to 10 years in prison and fines up to $250,000 per violation. Based on your evidence, we're looking at multiple felony counts that could result in decades of prison time. But the investigation revealed even more violations than I documented. When they searched Dr. Winters' office and home, they found years' worth of patient files that she'd illegally copied and kept for her own use. They discovered she'd been selling anonymized patient stories to pharmaceutical companies for market research, writing magazine articles based on patient cases without consent, and had even been negotiating a book deal featuring her most interesting patient stories. 6 months later, I sat in the front row of the formal licensing board hearing. The room was packed with former patients, journalists, other healthcare providers who'd come to witness the downfall of someone who'd violated the most sacred trust in medicine, and family members of patients whose privacy had been violated. Dr. Winters had lost significant weight and looked years older than she had in her office. Her expensive designer clothes had been replaced with a simple black suit that hung loosely on her diminished frame. Her once perfect hair was now streaked with gray, and she kept glancing nervously at the gallery full of people whose lives she'd damaged. Her attorney, a nervous man named David Kowalski, who clearly knew he was fighting a losing battle, tried desperately to argue that my recordings were illegally obtained and should be inadmissible. The licensing board's legal counsel shut that down immediately. "Patients have an absolute right to record their own therapy sessions," the counsel explained patiently. Dr. Winters' violations occurred in the presence of her patient, making all recordings completely legal and admissible under both state and federal law. When they called my name to testify, I stood up slowly, feeling the weight of every violated patient's hopes for justice on my shoulders. "Dr. Winters once told me that trust is fundamental to healing," I began, my voice carrying clearly through the silent room. She was absolutely right. When someone violates that trust, especially someone in a position of power and authority, it can reopen old wounds and create new trauma. But sometimes it can also give you the strength and determination to make sure they never hurt anyone else. I presented my evidence methodically, walking the board through 12 hours of recordings that documented systematic violations spanning multiple patients over several years. I showed them how she'd used our most vulnerable moments as entertainment, how she'd built professional presentations around our private struggles, how she'd turned our healing process into her personal profit center. The board members' faces grew increasingly grim as they listened to recording after recording of Dr. Winters laughing about patient traumas, sharing identifying information with unauthorized people, and treating confidential medical information like gossip to be traded for social currency. Dr. Winters' attorney tried to cross-examine me, suggesting that I'd entrapped his client by fabricating elaborate revenge fantasies specifically to provoke her violations. "So you admit you deliberately created fictional content designed to manipulate Dr. Winters into committing violations?" he asked, clearly thinking he'd found a weakness in my case. I smiled calmly, having anticipated this line of attack. "I told Dr. Winters exactly what she wanted to hear. Stories she could turn into entertainment for her dinner parties," I said. The fact that she encouraged and documented what she believed to be genuine violent fantasies, instead of properly treating them or referring me for appropriate care, only proves how unfit she is to practice therapy. The attorney's face fell as he realized his question had only made things worse for his client. Other patients testified about their own violations. Dr. Winters' former colleagues testified about suspicious conversations and inappropriate disclosures they'd witnessed but failed to report. Even her receptionist, Margaret, testified about the steady stream of personal calls where private patient information was discussed openly. The hearing lasted 3 days, with testimony from over 20 witnesses and presentation of hundreds of pieces of evidence. Dr. Winters herself never took the stand. On advice of her attorney, who knew that anything she said could be used against her in the pending criminal case, the board deliberated for 2 hours. Dr. Rebecca Winters' license was permanently revoked. She was ordered to pay fines totaling $75,000 to the state board and faced additional criminal charges for HIPAA violations that could result in prison time and federal fines exceeding $2 million. As we left the hearing, she approached me in the hallway. Her eyes were red-rimmed and desperate, her previously perfect appearance completely disheveled. "I hope destroying my life was worth your moment of revenge," she said bitterly, her voice shaking with rage and desperation. I looked at her calmly, feeling nothing but cold satisfaction and complete vindication. "I didn't destroy your life," I said. "Your choices destroyed your life. I just documented them and made sure the people you hurt knew what you'd done to them. You were supposed to be my patient, not my judge and jury. You're right. I was supposed to be your patient, but you turned me into your entertainment instead. You had a choice every single time you shared my private information. You chose to violate my trust for your own amusement." Her face crumpled as the full weight of her situation finally hit her. "I never meant for anyone to get hurt. It was just, people liked the stories. It made me popular at parties. I felt important. You felt important by making other people's pain into your personal comedy show," I said. "Every laugh you got was at the expense of someone who trusted you with their deepest trauma." A year later, I received a call from Detective Santos with the final update on the criminal case. Dr. Winters had pleaded guilty to 12 felony counts of HIPAA violations to avoid a trial that would have resulted in even harsher penalties. She'd received 3 years in federal prison and been ordered to pay restitution totaling $1.8 million to her victims. But more importantly, my case had opened floodgates of accountability throughout the mental health care system. 3 more former patients from her previous practice in Portland had come forward with similar complaints. The investigation revealed she'd been violating patient confidentiality for over a decade, using her clients' most vulnerable moments as party conversation and conference material across multiple states. The Federal Bureau of Investigation had taken over the case, treating it as organized healthcare fraud. They discovered an entire network of healthcare providers who'd been sharing patient information inappropriately, and several other therapists and doctors were now under investigation for similar violations. The licensing boards in 5 states had launched investigations into Dr. Winters' past practices and those of her associates. Her former colleagues were being questioned about what they knew and when they knew it. The entire mental health care system was implementing new oversight procedures, mandatory reporting requirements, and random compliance audits to prevent similar violations. I never went back to therapy after that experience, not because I didn't need it, but because I learned something more valuable than any session could teach me. Sometimes the best healing comes from refusing to let people get away with hurting you and making sure they can't hurt anyone else. The nonprofit I started, Patient Privacy Protection, now helps other victims of healthcare privacy violations navigate the legal system and fight back against providers who abuse their trust. We've helped secure convictions against 12 healthcare providers and recovered over $5 million in damages for violated patients. Last month, I was invited to speak at the American Psychological Association's annual conference, the same conference where Dr. Winters had planned to present my case as entertainment. I stood at the podium where she would have stood and told the real story of what happens when healthcare providers violate patient trust. The audience was silent throughout my presentation. When I finished, they gave me a standing ovation that lasted 5 minutes. After my speech, a young woman approached me. She was crying. "My therapist shared my eating disorder story at her book club," she said. "I thought I was crazy for being upset about it. Thank you for showing me I wasn't wrong to feel violated." I gave her my card and connected her with one of our attorneys. Some people collect stamps. Some people collect coins. Some people collect vintage wine or rare books. Dr. Rebecca Winters collected other people's pain and trauma, hoarding our most vulnerable moments like trophies to be displayed for social currency. But I collected something much more valuable: justice, accountability, and the satisfaction of knowing that a predator could no longer hurt the people who trusted her most. The best part? Every time someone Googles her name now, they find articles about her crimes. Every potential future patient she might have exploited will know exactly what kind of person she really is. Every dinner party she might attend will include people who know she's a convicted felon who betrayed the most sacred trust in healthcare. Her reputation, which she cared about more than her patients' well-being, is permanently destroyed. And that, as she might say if she were still licensed to practice therapy, is quite therapeutic indeed.